I want to talk about road stories and what they mean. When I mean road story, what do I infer of? Now, the road stories are stories that was about traveling and about in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s and 60s, basically in the mid 1990s, in the mid 90s, in the mid 1900s, there were people who were known as transients, gypsies and hippies, and they would travel to try and make a living for themselves because they were anti-establishment mostly, or they were just very poor people. Now, the road stories are not only comprised of hippies, and the ones I am mainly focusing on are people who were not there because of own choice, but they were there because of a cultural bust and a economical crash, which did happen, between times sandwiched between the First and the Second World War, and it was deprivation times. I mean, people were truly just economically, physically, culturally deprived, and this happens almost any every century. This happens. You can see it with like the Renaissance in the 1800s, and there were prior Renaissance in the 1600s. There were also movements of this, but um, these people were almost like they were the barriers, and they were the vagabonds of their time, and they were traveling to try and make a living for themselves, and it was extremely difficult because these people had nowhere to go, and they would try and they would sometimes find love and whatnot. They would meet other transients, and they would go to diners, which they tried to so they would go from place to place, from hub to hub, and they would try and make a living wherever they go and make a quick buck, and they travel. Many of these people had like broken cars or just exasperated vehicles, and they didn't really have a way to have a pick of the litter because they were poor people. And because I mean these people were all lower middle class people, impoverished individuals, people with no resources at all and no purchasing or spending power, and thus I mean they lived this extremely just almost like this unconceivable living style, and they died of a lot of diseases, and many times they used drugs. But I wanted to focus and territorize this type of genre of a road story because I thought a lot of times about my own life and how it was in a kind of way, how I got brushed up with people when traveling was their only resolve. They traveled with bikes, and they had guitars, or they didn't even have bicycles, or they didn't even have food. And I remember here in South Africa that I met people who told me that they were traveling like people in the 1960s, hippies. And certainly there was a time, even in the 1980s, where people had to, where they basically, just before technology and the media and the digital age just came, to fruit, there were definitely such people around. And I met a lot of these people as well. And I remember just the tears in their eyes of being unable to cope. A lot of these people had kids in them, and they didn't know how to look after their kids. But nevertheless, I mean, I probably have to go into the meat of the road story narrative that I was talking about before. So, as for road stories, I think one example of a road story that I would say is a road story is if you guys ever listen to the song You, Me and Bobby McGee from Chris Christopherson, it's about two travelers who meet, and Bobby McGee being one of the travelers. And this is out of a female's perspective, right? A song out of a female's perspective, but it's about two travelers, like transients, gypsies, if you will, who meet. And these people find similarities. They both are just the bottom of the pit. They have no economic justice. They have no way of leveraging. And they're just people who are not sure about what to do. And they eventually just travel. They do things together. They form a pack together, and they make some money together. And eventually they fall in love. Hence the name in Bobby McGee, and it's about the lover story as well. So there's like an encompassing artifact about the story. And eventually the tragedy that summons all road stories is people drift apart, either because of death that happens as a result of, well, commonly it's like drug overdoses, narcotics, also hit and runs, things that happen. It's like, you're literally living on the brinks of society. You're living at the scraps of, if you think about the road stories, these people, they're living many of them are just a pint away from homelessness. I mean, these people live on the brinks of society. They're living on the roads literally. So stuff happens on the roads. There's a lot of illness. Well, first there's a lot of diseases. A lot of these people got they didn't have the medical care because of the medical. There was no such thing as a medical fund, or the medical services were like really poorly back then. I mean, if you think about just the funding of medical services and so on, so dentistry, all these things were not. They were underfunded, and there weren't you know, the whole idea of a public sector funding the medical, directories was something that was spectral and unheard of, and as such, these people had underfunded resources, and unfortunately, they couldn't really make use of anything related to the people with a high stature, which were the corporates and the merchants and people like that. So, as such, they were extremely impoverished, and they faltered in life, they faltered in traveling, they faltered in the world, and they found other people. Is like, how do people meet? Well, they meet a significant. It's said in South Africa a lot of times that birds of the same feather flock together. I mean, just like with transients, they met other transients who were also in the same economic league as they were, and these people would meet and they would form friendships. And then yet again, well, the friendships wouldn't last because death oftentimes happens, and just journeys would part. Like, I think that was one of the main consensus of road stories is journeys, and the fact that two people can, and it's obviously relatable to old stories, like old fiction, old, just I think the typical memoirs that people wrote, very early on in the 1900s and 1800s, like even earlier, even say, I would probably be bickering, or I would do an injustice to the prior century when I mention a specific one, because there are so many centuries that people written things like memoirs or first-hand accounts before journalism was there and before we had this idea of an overspread of information. uh, what made the idea of a memoir, of a personal statement, so extremely concrete was the very fact of impermanence. Today with the digital media, you gotta understand, people have a print, they got a fingerprint of someone else. When you go on Facebook, when you go on, let's say, Twitter or anywhere else, you can see the same person in 50, 60 years. You can follow them. It wasn't the same for people who were in the Midwest or, traveled, let's say Nebraska or, the old canyons. These people, well, they had pit stops, and they would go to the coffee, joints, and they would move away, and you would never see these people again. And even the people who meet, and this is what is the big, I think that the big holism about the road stories, and that makes them so extremely real and grasping, is this idea of impermanence, this idea of complete, just this fleetingness, this time fleetingness, this ephemeralness is what makes this story so real and cutting. And this song is pretty much about that. And eventually, the two people drift apart, and that's a sad thing. And I think that's what makes these road stories so damn good, because it's in a sense folklore, like American folk. If you think about the American culture, you think about the diners. And the diners have histories to them. They have histories. And if you think about a modern day diner, like they represent the older diners, but kind of hammer-fisted restaurants, in being a kind of legacy of fools and kings. They were almost like class inclusive, non-discriminatory, and contemporaries and strangers met with different life experiences. And I think this is what made these venues so extremely unique and particular to restaurants or hotels. I do think if you think about the old subway cultures, the subways, you think about a couple things. You think about busking, homeless, and you think about transients, and you think about, and that's exactly the coalition where diners actually came to age, is that type of atmosphere. It was the times of homeless, depression, economic regress, and I mean that's exactly the culture that that the diners are equated to, and that's exactly what you get with the atmosphere sometimes about going in there. It's like it's truly a gravestone of the past. There were the dens for people who traveled, and a lot of the people who traveled were transients, and the diners were as such. the portals for these transients, and the people, well, the staff working for these diners were, they were visible to all the problems in the world. Sometimes these people were even, well, the staff, of course, like the waitress or the waitresses or the managers, got eye to eye with people who were at the brinks of society. People suffering from cancer and have only one. And a lot of times these people would travel and they would buy a coffee, let's say, at a diner, and they would talk about someone else in their vicinity or in their own collective, who would then, there would be conversations going. So if you go today, let's say, to a restaurant, an upper class restaurant, you won't really see this because people going there are just out on a night. But the diners in those times were different. It was portals where anyone could go in there and eat something. So you saw literally the whole canvas of society in one little spot. And this is to me why I think, coming from a diner perspective, and I mean I have a lot of respect for diners because, in the past they were 24/7. They were open 24/7. They were truly the old McDonald's, and the Burger Kings, and they were these places for the West, and they were the treasury items that a lot of people made use of. And I remember back in university, I used to go to a diner, and just the type of people going there, I used to order a pizza, and just the way that people would train. I mean, diners are extremely American if you think about it. Like, there's almost like no cooperation from the waitress, the waiters and the waitress or the staff. They don't talk to you. You would see that they will leave you. They would do the orders, and they won't talk to you a lot. They won't. They would probably mention something and they would walk off. That's kind of how people. I think it comes from these times where people were trained to respect other people's privacy, and the diners are really, well. The diners being these portals and these hubs, the waiters and the waitresses would just serve someone and they would leave the person in peace because this was a hub of, different idiosyncratical personalities. And the diners weren't like restaurants. They were everything but restaurants. They were places where people would meet with different life experiences. So you know that there's almost like nothing in common. Let's say a waiter going to someone in a diner, there's nothing in common she has with that person. She doesn't know, unless she knows you, but there's a common form of, I think, a reciprocity or agreeableness or respect that I think that happened back in those times with people. Just you don't know that person at all, so you didn't assume stuff about that person. And um, to go back to this idea of the road stories is, well, out of my own life, I had experiences that resembled the road stories. I had an experience that I remember when I was 7 years old. We went to this almost like a resort, and there were the people who owned this resort. Well, they had a 7-year old girl. She was my age and stuff, and she immediately fell in love with me. Like, she just liked me and stuff, and we had a very good friendship. I remember the 4 days that we were there. She would always come and knock on the door, and we would open, and she would want to play with me and stuff. And uh, I remember she got extremely, just very personal in a way. She told me about all her family problems and stuff. Okay, her mum and dad were going to get divorced soon, and she would be very sad about it. But I got extremely close to her in 4 days, and we went home after that point. And I remember about a couple of years after that point, we came back. We wanted to have another run with the holiday there, and it was a pretty nice spot. And I immediately, first thing, thought, I'm going to meet. Her name is Anna, by the way, and I thought, I'm going to be meeting Anna again. She has that resort, and just as life has it, people are moving away. And Anna was one of these unlucky fortunes where um, I never saw her again. And I asked the old man who was working in the garden, like, what happened to Anna? Like, they had this place, and he told me Anna moved away. She and her family moved away, and it was tragic. And I had no way of recollecting the conversation. Like, no, that's, I think, one of the saddest things about drifting away. It's a very, very sad thing. Someone once said life is like a train. People hop on and they hop off, and the train would stop and you die. And this really links very well with road stories because the themes of death and grief is, I think, is so real, and especially people on this channel and on YouTube under the incel or the we understand loneliness very well. We understand what it is to grieve, to grieve a former time when everyone was alive and life made complete sense. That there was a purpose. You felt young. It's just I think now it's just looking back at the old times and realizing why things have been a treasure chest or an absolute pit of hell. And at this point, I can see the markers of bad fate. And I think this is just the purpose of this video, is talking about why I think that the common narrative of the road stories are so appealing to a lot of us, to a lot of people, to even to the common pop culture in the old times, because of its truisms and aphorisms of truth. And I think this is the end of my video, at least. I would like to hear your opinions and suggestions of other stories like this, and what you think about this whole narrative of the road stories and traveling, and what makes it sad to you. I'd like to hear your voice, your opinions, and your comments. So do reply.